The palace stood in silence after the passing of the late queen. For years, her presence had been the strength of the royal household, and now without her, everything felt empty and cold. The long corridors, once alive with her soft voice and careful steps, echoed only with the sound of guards moving quietly and servants walking with lowered heads. The heart of the palace was heavy with grief, but at the same time, it carried another kind of weight, the weight of protecting the queen's legacy, her belongings, and especially her jewels. These jewels were not just expensive stones, they carried history, memories, and the respect of a nation. In the middle of the sadness, Edward, a young royal guard, stood faithfully at his post. He was not like many others who treated this as just another job. Edward believed in loyalty and honor. He had promised himself that as long as he wore the royal uniform, nothing and no one would touch what belonged to the queen. The jewels, locked in a chamber, were his main concern. Every night, he made extra rounds to check the locks, doors, and windows. He knew that in times of grief, strange things could happen. People sometimes showed their true selves when no one expected it. One evening, while the palace was quiet and most staff had retired, Edward noticed something unusual. Camilla, who often carried herself with pride and authority, was walking through the corridor in plain clothes. She was not dressed in her usual elegant outfits. Instead, she wore something simple, as if she did not want to be recognized. Edward found this strange. Why would she be moving quietly at night, avoiding eye contact with the guards? His instincts told him something was wrong. He stayed still, hiding slightly behind a column, his sharp eyes following her every move. Camilla's steps were slow but determined. She glanced left and right, making sure no one was watching. Edward felt his heart beat faster. He had learned to read body language, and hers was clear. She was not simply wandering. She had a purpose, and that purpose made her appear uneasy. She headed toward the one place Edward always kept close to his heart, the chamber of the Queen's jewels. Edward wanted to believe he was mistaken. Perhaps she was going there with permission. Perhaps she had a reason he could not yet understand. But when she pulled out a small key and unlocked the door, slipping inside quickly, Edward's suspicion grew stronger. He knew that access to the chamber was limited and guarded by strict rules. Very few people had such keys, and even fewer dared to use them at night. For a few moments, Edward stood frozen, wondering what he should do. To accuse someone of such high standing was dangerous. A wrong move could cost him his post, his reputation, even his future. But his duty whispered in his ear the jewels must be protected at all costs. Slowly, he followed her path, careful not to make a sound. Through the half-open door, Edward saw the chamber glow with the light of gold and diamonds. Camilla stood before the glass cases, her hands moving quickly. She opened one box after another, picking up necklaces, bracelets, and rings, slipping them into a velvet bag she carried. Her face showed no sadness, no hesitation. It was the face of someone who believed no one would dare to stop her. Edward's heart sank. The Queen had trusted everyone around her, and now here was someone betraying that trust. For a moment, Edward thought of stepping back and pretending he had seen nothing. After all, who would believe him? But then he remembered the Queen's smile, her words of kindness to the guards, her faith in loyalty. That memory gave him strength. He stayed hidden, watching carefully, letting her fill the bag. He wanted no doubt, no question about what he saw. His eyes confirmed every movement. The jewels, one after another, disappeared into her possession. The velvet bag grew heavy, and Camilla, with a small sigh, closed the glass case. She looked around once more, then started to head toward the door. Edward knew this was the moment. If he waited longer, she would walk out and perhaps disappear into the night with treasures that belonged to history. He tightened his grip on his uniform belt, took a steady breath, and prepared himself for what could change his life forever. When she stepped into the corridor, Edward was already there, standing tall. Their eyes met, and for a brief second, Camilla's face froze. Surprise, fear, and anger flickered across her expression. She had not expected anyone to be there, least of all Edward, the guard known for his sharp sense of duty. The corridor felt colder than ever. The jewels in her bag sparkled faintly under the dim lights, and Edward's eyes remained fixed on them. He did not speak immediately, he wanted her to realize she had been caught. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Camilla's lips parted as if to explain, but Edward did not move. His presence alone told her that excuses would not work easily. His eyes carried the weight of truth, and his stance showed he was ready to act. For Edward, this was not just about jewels. It was about loyalty, honor, and respect for the Queen's memory. At that moment, the palace no longer felt like a place of grief. It became the stage for a test of courage. Edward knew what he had to do, even if it meant standing against someone more powerful than him. His heart beat strong, but his spirit was steady. He had caught her in the act, and the night was no longer quiet. It was the beginning of a story that would echo through the palace walls for years to come. Edward's eyes stayed fixed on Camilla as she stood frozen in the corridor, clutching the velvet bag close to her chest. The silence between them was heavy, almost unbearable. Every second felt longer than the last. The distant ticking of the grand hallway clock echoed through the palace, reminding Edward of the weight of each passing moment. He knew he had reached the point where hesitation was no longer possible. His duty demanded action. He took a step forward, his polished boots clicking against the marble floor. The sound made Camilla flinch. Her eyes darted around as if she was searching for an escape, but the corridor was narrow, and Edward's tall figure blocked her path. "Where are you going with that?" Edward asked firmly, his voice steady, though his heart was racing inside his chest. Camilla forced a smile, one that looked more nervous than genuine. "Edward, you misunderstand," she said quickly, her tone smooth yet shaky at the edges. "These jewels are not safe here anymore. I was only moving them to a safer place. You know how things are after the Queen's passing. It's better if someone responsible keeps them." Her words flowed easily, but Edward was not convinced. He had watched her closely in the chamber. Her hands had moved too quickly, too greedily, for this to be about protection. He knew the difference between care and theft. Still, he gave her one chance to explain herself. "Let me see the bag," Edward said calmly, though his eyes were sharp and unyielding. Camilla's grip tightened around the velvet bag. For a moment, she looked as if she might refuse outright. Then she sighed and loosened her hold, reluctantly opening it just enough for Edward to see inside. The dim corridor light revealed the glitter of diamonds, emeralds, and pearls. The Queen's crown, with its delicate design and shimmering stones, lay at the very top. Edward's chest tightened. There was no doubt anymore. These were not being moved for safety, they were being stolen. Camilla quickly pulled the bag shut again. "I told you," she said, her voice sharper now, "I was only protecting them. You don't understand the threats we face. Anyone could take them, but I know how to keep them safe." Edward stood his ground, his hands behind his back in the posture of a guard, but his words carried the authority of truth. "The only threat I see," he said slowly, "is right in front of me." Camilla's face hardened. She was not used to being spoken to in this way, especially by someone she considered beneath her. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to almost a whisper. "Do you realize what you're doing? If you speak against me, you'll ruin yourself. No one will believe you. They will believe me. I am trusted here." But Edward did not waver. His loyalty to the Queen and his own honor outweighed the fear of consequences. He had faced difficult choices before, but nothing as dangerous as this. The weight of the palace, its history, and its silent walls seemed to press down on him, reminding him that he was not just one man, he was the guardian of a legacy. He took another step closer, standing so near that Camilla had to tilt her head to meet his gaze. "Return the jewels to the chamber," he said firmly, "before this becomes worse than it already is." For a brief moment, Camilla's composure cracked. Her hands trembled, and her lips pressed tightly together. But then, just as quickly, she tried to recover her authority. "You are overstepping," she hissed. "You're just a guard. Guards follow orders, they do not give them." Edward's jaw tightened. He felt the danger in her words, the threat against his position. Yet deep down, he knew that silence would make him complicit. He could not betray the Queen's memory by allowing her jewels to be stolen. The standoff grew tense. Neither moved, neither backed down. Edward could sense the weight of her influence, but he also sensed the fear behind her eyes. She had been caught, and she knew it. Her excuses, her authority, even her threats could not erase the truth of what he had seen. Finally, Edward broke the silence. "If you were protecting them, you would not be sneaking in the night," he said. "If you were protecting them, you would not hide them in a bag. And if you were protecting them, you would not tremble when caught." The words struck Camilla hard. Her face flushed with anger, and for a moment, she looked as if she might lash out. But Edward's unwavering presence stopped her. She realized she could not simply talk her way out of this. Still, she tried one last time. "Edward, listen to me," she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "Think carefully. If you stand against me, you'll regret it. I can help you. I can make your life easier, more comfortable. Nobody needs to know what you saw tonight. You and I can keep this between us." Her words hung in the air like poison, tempting yet dangerous. Edward felt the pull of temptation for only a brief second, the thought of safety, of comfort. But then he remembered the Queen's gentle voice, her trust in her guards, and the pride he felt every time he wore his uniform. He straightened his shoulders. "No," he said simply. "My loyalty is not for sale." Camilla's eyes widened. For the first time, she looked truly shaken. She realized she could not manipulate him, not with lies, not with threats, not even with promises. Edward had chosen his side, and it was not hers. The tension in the corridor deepened as Edward stepped slightly aside, motioning toward the chamber. "Return them," he repeated, his voice calm but commanding. "Now." Camilla's chest rose and fell quickly, her breath uneven. She knew she was trapped. Yet instead of obeying, she clutched the bag tighter, her knuckles turning white. "You'll regret this," she whispered bitterly. Edward did not move, his steady presence unshaken. The palace walls around them seemed to grow taller, bearing silent witness to the confrontation. The jewels sparkled faintly through the velvet bag, as though reminding both of them what was truly at stake. The choice now lay before Camilla: to surrender and face shame, or to defy and face exposure. Edward stood ready, his eyes locked on hers, determined to see the Queen's treasures return to their rightful place. The night was no longer quiet. It was filled with the tension of truth pressing against deception, honor against betrayal. And Edward knew that whatever happened next would decide not just the fate of the jewels, but also the weight of his own destiny as a royal guard. Edward stood like a stone pillar in the corridor, his eyes fixed on Camilla, who clutched the velvet bag as if it were her lifeline. The silence was sharp, heavy, and it pressed down on both of them. The jewels inside the bag seemed to glow faintly under the corridor's dim lights, and every glimmer only deepened Edward's resolve. He had caught her in the act, and there was no going back. Camilla tried to calm her breathing. She had always relied on her charm, her words, and her influence to bend others to her will. But tonight was different. Edward was not bending. His eyes carried truth, and his stance carried duty. She realized that lies alone might not save her. Still, she decided to try once more. Edward, she began, softening her voice, you must see reason. These jewels are not safe here. The palace is full of eyes, and hands are always reaching for what is not theirs. I am the only one who can truly protect them. You know that. Edward did not flinch. His gaze did not waver. His voice, calm but unshakable, answered her claim. If you were protecting them, you would not be here in secret, under the cover of night. Protection is done in the light, with honesty. Theft is done in shadows. You chose the shadows. Her lips tightened. She realized her first attempt had failed. She quickly shifted her tone, her voice becoming more commanding. Do you know who I am? Do you know the position I hold? I can end your career with a single word. You are a guard, nothing more. One order from me, and you'll be stripped of your post by sunrise. Edward felt the threat, but he stood firm. He had lived with discipline his whole life. His loyalty was not to titles or fear, it was to the Queen's memory. The Queen had once told him, a guard without honor is no guard at all. Those words now echoed in his heart. He drew strength from them. You may end my post, Edward said slowly, but you cannot erase the truth of what I saw. You cannot erase what you did with your own hands. Power may silence others, but it cannot silence my conscience. Camilla's face flushed red. She had never been spoken to like this by a guard. Her pride stung, her authority felt challenged. For a brief moment, her mask slipped, and Edward saw not confidence but desperation in her eyes. She quickly covered it, straightening her back and letting her voice drip with false calm. Perhaps you are right, she said suddenly, trying a new tactic. Perhaps I should not have come here in secret. But understand this, I only did what I thought was best. I cared for the Queen deeply. I could not bear the thought of her treasures falling into careless hands. That bag, she nodded to it, is not filled with greed. It is filled with responsibility. Her words were clever, but Edward's sharp memory betrayed her. He remembered how her hands had moved in the chamber, too quick, too eager, too careless. He remembered the way her eyes had gleamed, not with sorrow but with hunger. He shook his head. Responsibility does not hide jewels in velvet bags. Responsibility does not fear to be caught. Camilla's shoulders stiffened. She realized her excuses were failing. She tried one last desperate path, persuasion through promises. Edward, she whispered, stepping closer, you don't have to stand against me. You can stand with me. Do you know what that means? Comfort. Security. Respect. No one would dare question you if you were on my side. You could rise higher than just being a guard. Tonight can change your life. Edward looked into her eyes, and for a brief moment, he saw the glitter of temptation. A comfortable life. No risks. No enemies. Just silence and reward. For a man who had stood in the cold corridors for years, who had lived a life of strict duty, the offer could have been sweet. But Edward's soul would not let him bend. He had sworn his loyalty to the Queen, and her memory was worth more than any comfort. My life, Edward replied firmly, is not for sale. My loyalty cannot be traded for gold or respect. I am a guard, yes, but I am also a man of honor. That is something you cannot offer me. Camilla's breath caught in her throat. She felt her confidence crumble. She had exhausted her lies, her threats, and her promises. Nothing moved him. His words struck her like heavy stones. She tightened her grip on the velvet bag until her knuckles turned white. Edward then took a step closer. His presence seemed larger, stronger, and for the first time, Camilla felt truly cornered. Open the bag fully, he commanded, his voice low but sharp. Her eyes darted nervously. Slowly, with shaky hands, she loosened the knot and pulled the bag open. The jewels sparkled under the corridor like the queen's necklaces, her bracelets, and the crown itself sat there in a pile of brilliance. Edward's eyes hardened as he confirmed the truth. Camilla's voice trembled as she tried once more. Please, Edward. Think of what you're doing. If you expose this, you'll destroy me. You'll create chaos in the palace. Nobody wants scandal right now, not after the queen's passing. It will tear the household apart. Do you want that on your shoulders? Edward's heart ached at her words. He knew scandal would indeed bring pain. Whispers would spread, the world would judge, and the palace would shake. But what weighed heavier, allowing a theft to go unpunished, or facing the storm with honor? He chose the storm. If the truth brings scandal, Edward said slowly, then it is better than lies bringing silence. Camilla's lips trembled. She had no answer. For the first time, she understood that Edward could not be swayed. She was not facing a mere guard. She was facing a wall of loyalty, unshaken by fear or desire. The corridor fell silent again. The jewels lay exposed, the truth undeniable. Edward felt the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders, but he stood straight, ready for what would come. Camilla stood across from him, powerless, her carefully built mask now broken. In that silence, Edward knew one thing for certain: this was no longer just about jewels. It was about justice. It was about loyalty. It was about showing that even in a palace of power, truth still had a voice. The decision had been made. Edward would not step back, he would not be silenced, and he would not betray the queen's memory. The confrontation had ended, but the next step, the act that would change both their lives, was only about to begin. Edward stood with his shoulders squared, the weight of duty pressing hard against him. The velvet bag remained in Camilla's trembling hands, its jewels shining faintly through the fabric. The air in the corridor was still, but beneath that stillness was a storm. Edward knew this was the moment that would decide everything. Either silence would bury the truth, or courage would bring it into the light. Camilla's lips tightened as she studied Edward's face. She could see that his mind was made up, and fear began to creep through her veins. For years, she had been surrounded by people who bowed to her words, who obeyed her without question. But this guard was different. He was not afraid of her. His eyes held a firmness that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Edward finally broke the silence. "You will return these jewels to their rightful place," he said firmly. His voice did not rise, but its steadiness carried more strength than any shout. Camilla shook her head slightly. "You don't know what you are doing," she whispered. "If you expose me, you will regret it. Everyone will turn against you. I am not someone you can order." But Edward did not waver. "Tonight you are not above the law of honor," he replied. "The queen's treasures are not yours to take. They belong to history, to the nation, to the memory of the woman we all served. You will not walk out of this palace with them." Camilla's composure cracked, and anger flashed across her face. "Do you really think anyone will believe a guard over me? I have influence, Edward. I have allies. I can destroy your name before the sun rises." Her words were sharp, but Edward stood straighter. "Then destroy me," he answered. "Better my name be broken than my honor." The firmness in his tone unsettled her. She realized then that she could not bend him with threats, nor win him with promises. He was a man who carried the queen's memory like a shield, and no blade of words could pierce it. Edward knew he could not stand alone in this moment. He turned his head slightly and called into the stillness of the palace. "Guards!" His voice rang through the corridor, echoing off the tall stone walls. Footsteps approached quickly, the sound of armor and boots filling the silence. 2 more guards appeared at the far end of the hall, their faces curious but alert. They saw Edward, saw Camilla, and their eyes widened at the sight of the velvet bag. "What is this?" one of them asked. Edward stood tall and pointed at the bag in Camilla's hands. "The queen's jewels, he said with calm authority. Taken without right. Camilla's face paled as the two guards exchanged shocked glances. She tried to regain control, raising her voice with urgency. "This is a misunderstanding," she declared. "I was protecting these jewels. I had reason to fear for their safety. Edward has twisted what he saw." But Edward did not allow her words to spread further. He reached forward, took the bag from her hands with a firm grip, and opened it for all to see. The jewels glistened under the torchlight: necklaces, rings, bracelets, and the crown itself. The other guards gasped quietly. "This is no misunderstanding," Edward said clearly. "These jewels were hidden, taken away from their rightful place. I witnessed it with my own eyes. I stand as a guard of the Queen, and I will not allow betrayal to go unseen." The two guards looked at Camilla with disbelief. For years, she had carried herself with authority, but now they saw her cornered, powerless, caught in the act. Camilla's lips trembled, and her hands shook. She tried to reach for words, but none came strong enough. Edward returned the jewels to the chamber, locking them once more in their cases. His movements were steady, almost ceremonial, as if he was returning a crown to its throne. When the last jewel was secured, he closed the door and turned back to Camilla. "You will leave this palace," Edward declared. His voice was low but unshakable, echoing in the hall. Camilla's eyes widened. "You dare," she whispered in disbelief. Edward nodded once. "Yes. For betrayal cannot stay where loyalty is meant to live." The other guards hesitated, unsure whether they should follow Edward's command. Camilla was powerful, and they feared the consequences. But when they looked into Edward's eyes, they saw certainty. They saw courage that demanded respect. Slowly, both nodded and moved to her side. Camilla pulled back, her pride clashing with her fear. "You cannot do this," she muttered. "You are just a guard." Edward stepped closer, his gaze unyielding. "I am a guard," he said, "but tonight, that means more than your influence. Tonight, it means standing between betrayal and truth." The two guards gently but firmly guided Camilla toward the exit. Her steps were unsteady, her face pale. The silence of the palace pressed down, broken only by the soft sound of her shoes on the marble floor. For the first time in years, she was not being followed with respect but with watchful eyes of suspicion. Edward walked behind them, his presence steady, ensuring the order was carried out. The long corridor seemed endless, each step echoing the weight of justice. Camilla's once confident posture slumped under the reality of her situation. At the grand doors of the palace, the guards stopped. Edward moved forward, his face calm but stern. "This is where it ends," he said. "You are no longer welcome here. The Queen's jewels remain, but you do not." Camilla's chest rose and fell quickly. She looked at Edward, her eyes filled with both anger and disbelief. She had been thrown out not by nobles or advisors, but by a guard, a man she once considered beneath her notice. That humiliation cut deeper than anything else. The great doors opened, and the cool night air swept in. The stars above seemed to watch silently as Camilla stepped outside. She turned once, her lips parting as if to curse Edward, but no words came. Her voice failed her, just as her power had. With one final glance of defeat, she walked into the darkness. The doors closed slowly, their heavy sound echoing like a judgment. Inside, Edward stood still, his heart pounding but his spirit calm. He had done what many would have feared to do. He had defended the Queen's honor, even against someone with influence. The two guards looked at him with awe. One spoke softly, "You have risked everything, Edward. But tonight, you have honored the Queen more than anyone else could." Edward gave a small nod. He felt no pride, only the quiet weight of duty fulfilled. The palace was safe, the jewels were secure, and the truth had been defended. But deep inside, he knew this was not the end. The storm would come in the days ahead, whispers, questions, perhaps even revenge. Yet for now, the silence of the palace was no longer heavy with betrayal. It was filled with the strength of one man's courage. The palace stirred with whispers before dawn. News had a strange way of moving through the halls, faster than footsteps and lighter than air. What had happened in the night was not yet public, but the servants, the guards, and even the advisors sensed that something unusual had taken place. They noticed the absence of Camilla, who was usually present in the early hours. They noticed the look on Edward's face, calm yet heavy, as though he had stood against a storm and survived it. The jewels, locked once more inside their chamber, sparkled silently, as if they too were relieved to be safe. For Edward, returning them was not just a duty but a promise kept. Each necklace, each bracelet, each crown was more than gold and gems. They were memories of the late queen, her laughter at celebrations, her pride during ceremonies, her quiet dignity in the face of trials. Protecting them was the last service Edward could give her, even after her passing. Yet Edward knew the silence would not last. A story like this could not be buried in the walls of the palace. He prepared himself for what would come: disbelief from some, anger from others, perhaps even danger to his own position. Still, he had chosen truth, and truth was rarely easy. By mid-morning, the palace was buzzing. Servants spoke in hushed tones, guards exchanged knowing glances, and advisors whispered in corners. The question lingered everywhere: where was Camilla? And more importantly, why had Edward looked so stern and unshaken? The official word came soon enough. A senior advisor entered the great hall, followed by Edward and the two guards who had witnessed everything. The chamber was filled with faces, some curious, some suspicious, some worried. The air grew tense as the advisor cleared his throat. "It is with great gravity," he began, "that we must speak of what occurred last night." His eyes swept across the hall before resting on Edward. This guard stood against an act that would have dishonored the Queen's memory. The jewels were taken from their chamber in secrecy. But through his loyalty, they have been returned, unharmed. Gasps echoed through the hall. The very idea that anyone would dare to touch the late Queen's jewels was shocking. When the advisor named Camilla, the silence deepened. Some covered their mouths in disbelief. Others shook their heads, unwilling to accept the truth. But the evidence was undeniable. The jewels had been found in her possession, and Edward had stood witness. Edward stepped forward, not to boast, but to speak. His voice was steady and respectful. "I did only what was required of me," he said. "I served the Queen in life, and I will continue to serve her memory. The jewels are safe, and her honor remains untouched. That is enough." The hall was silent for a long moment, and then, slowly, people began to nod. The murmurs shifted from doubt to respect. They saw in Edward not just a guard, but a man who had chosen duty over fear, truth over silence. Outside the palace, whispers grew into stories, and stories grew into legends. Servants spoke of how Edward had stood firm against someone powerful. Guards retold the tale of the night when loyalty outweighed influence. Even common people in the city began to hear pieces of the story, passed from one voice to another. To them, it was not just about jewels, it was about justice. It was about a guard who proved that even in a palace of power, one honest heart could make a difference. Camilla's absence became permanent. She did not return, and her name was spoken less and less within the palace walls. Some pitied her downfall, others were angered by her betrayal, but all agreed that Edward's actions had saved the palace from shame. For Edward, life did not change in appearance. He still walked the corridors with his usual steady pace, still checked the doors and windows at night, still stood guard during the day. But in truth, everything had changed. He was no longer just another guard. When people looked at him, they saw the man who had dared to act when silence would have been easier. One evening, as Edward stood watch near the chamber of the jewels, An older servant approached him quietly. She had worked for the queen for decades and had seen more than most. Her eyes were soft with gratitude as she whispered, "She would have been proud of you. The queen trusted her guards, and last night, you proved her trust was never misplaced." Those words struck Edward deeper than any reward or recognition could. He did not need titles or wealth. To know that he had honored the queen's memory was enough to carry him through the weight of what had happened. Time moved on, and the palace slowly returned to its rhythm. But the story of that night did not fade. It was told again and again, each time with new details, each time with the same core truth: a royal guard had caught Camilla stealing the late queen's jewels and had thrown her out. Children of the servants would whisper it to each other as a tale of bravery. Guards would speak of it as an example of loyalty. Advisors would recall it whenever the question of honor arose. And Edward himself, though humble, carried it quietly in his heart. The jewels remained in their chamber, untouched and safe, a symbol of history preserved. But more than that, Edward's action had become a different kind of jewel, one of honor, courage, and truth. It shone not with gold or diamonds but with the strength of a man who had chosen to stand tall when others might have bowed. Years later, when people remembered the late queen, they also remembered the guard who had stood in the quiet night to protect her legacy. His name became part of the palace's story, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, light could be found in the courage of one loyal heart. And so, Edward continued his life as a guard, never asking for recognition, never seeking reward. But within the walls of the palace, his story lived on, not as a tale of scandal but as a lesson of loyalty. The queen's jewels still sparkled in their chamber, but the greatest treasure was the memory of that night, the night when truth triumphed, and a guard's courage threw out betrayal.